An international team of 20 canoeists, led by Yorkshireman Chris Hawkesworth, take on the raging river of Annapurna in the Himalayas.
In October 1980, veteran expedition leader Chris Hawkesworth assembled a large team of 20 top canoeists. Their destination, the Marsyandi River, the fabled raging river of Annapurna. This was the largest team ever to attempt to canoe the white waters of the Himalayas, and it included, in addition to the 15 British paddlers, 2 Canadian, 2 Irish and 1 Dutch paddler. A ramshackle bus chartered in Kathmandu takes the team to the put-in point on the Trisuli River. Chris Hawkesworth, expedition leader, explains exactly what the team can expect over the next 3 days.
Now, when this bus gets down to the bottom of the hill, we come to the checkpoint at the start of the Chinese road, the Prithvi Highway. We're due to meet Nigel and the other 2 that have brought the Land Rover up to India. The Sherpas will unload the rafts, blow them up, we'll sort our own personal gear out, and then we'll get on the river. Now, what you can expect on the Trisuli is quite long flat bits, interspersed with quite big rapids.
It had been decided to do 3 days training on the Trisuli River before the serious business of canoeing the Marsyandi began. The Trisuli River flows east to west alongside the main Kathmandu-Pokhara road. Chris Hawkesworth calculated that the training would be essential, but even after the first day, reactions were mixed. Anton Juranchuk, the other Canadian.
I really don't think this is the kind of thing that's adequately going to prepare people for the really tight technical stuff. Up in the Marsyandi, I expect it's going to be very, very tight, very steep, very fast. You are absolutely going to have to make certain eddies, or you could be in a lot of trouble.
Mike Thompson.
I think the training so far has been really good for us. Certainly good for me. I've never been on water with this power before.
Di Brown.
I must say, I haven't been as nervous as I thought. I thought I'd be more worried. I've come out to canoe, but I want to go back alive.
Bob Smith.
I think the training was necessary because we've all had a very long flight. We were in Kathmandu for a long time, and it's just nice to get in a kayak regardless of what sort of water you're on. The expedition consisted of 12 British, 2 Canadian, 2 Irish and 1 Dutch paddler. It gave us a chance to break the ice and get to know each other on big waters and find out each other's capabilities. If you're paddling a big river, you want to know who you're going to paddle with and who you can rely on if you're getting difficulty. I mean, we've all paddled in the Alps, but this water is so different. There's so much power behind it, and the volume of water is quite amazing. In the UK, we tend to be very used to stoppers that tend to come back on themselves. And a hold about, where these things are massive big holes. Initially, they're really frightening, but if you keep your cool and just hang on in it, they'll normally spit you out one way or another. But one wonders whether it's giving you a false confidence.
Mike Clugston, who had the advantage of being used to big rivers in Canada, had reservations about the canoeing standards of some of the others.
In the first 2 days paddling on the Trisuli River, there have been 5 swimmers. That seems like an awful lot, but this is a shakedown run, it's a shakedown paddle, and so with new gear and big water to get used to, it's no wonder that there are a few kayakers who are swimming. But it's just as well that these swims are happening on the Trisuli and not on the Marsyandi. But the Marsyandi will be an entirely different story. Where the Trisuli is warm, the Marsyandi will be ice cold. Where the Trisuli moves at about 9 miles an hour, the Marsyandi will move at 25 miles an hour. Where the rapids of the Trisuli are interspersed with calm places where rescues and boat recovery are easily made, the Marsyandi rapids go on continuously, mile after mile, so that a swim could put a paddler in very, very serious jeopardy indeed. So judging from what we've seen so far on the Trisuli, it seems that those who will tackle the toughest sections of the Marsyandi will be a small crew indeed, maybe no more than 6 paddlers.
The Trisuli River was bigger and faster than had been expected and was giving some members of the team a tough time. But after the second day, the good canoeists were beginning to emerge. Frank Staniland from Sheffield, Peter van Stipdonk the Dutchman, and the Irishman Jerry Collins. But it was the 2 Canadians, Mike Clugston and Anton Jiranchuk, who looked most impressive.
You can pretty well float down this river without too much danger. And I think the important thing is maintaining control, not trying to fight it, and just experiencing it, just enjoying it coming down, because it was just a blast.
John Goodwin.
That's upset rapid. The reason they call it upset is that the waves are rolling in from either side, and if you don't watch them, then the next thing you know, you're upside down.
The third day on the Trisuli brought the first casualty when Frank Staniland paddled into the most enormous hole.
I felt the deck flatten and was trapped against a rock underwater, and there's nothing I could do about it because the boat had folded against a rock. It happened so quickly, although it seems a long time while you're underwater. the thing to do. You're just trying to fight your way out of the boat, even ripping the boat apart with your bare hands, because it's the only thing you can do while you're under there. And at that point, I thought there was no way I was going to get out. The biggest problem with swimming in water of that sort of speed is the power of it bashing you against rocks. The idea basically is to try and swim feet first to fend yourself off any rocks, but what happens, it just bowls you over and over and over, and you come up, you don't know where you are, which way you're facing or anything. You've got to fend yourself all the time away from the rocks to prevent yourself getting battered. There's no way you can swim against it, it's just too much power. Luckily the rafts come out and get you.
Frank's accident was a lesson to the entire team, for it was only Frank's foresight and cool nerve that enabled him to smash the deck of his canoe in order to escape, otherwise he would have drowned. Up to this point, Frank had been mixing it on the river with the best of them, but this incident blunted his enthusiasm for several days. Frank's accident marked the end of the training on the Trisuli and the start of the 14-day march into the Annapurna Mountains to find the source of the Marsyandi, the raging river the team had travelled halfway around the world to see. Mike Clugston.
The Sherpas do an amazing job. They serve hot tea to us in our sleeping bags at 5:45 every morning. They have breakfast ready. Then they get ahead of us on the trail, and by the time we get to a lunch spot, a hot cooked lunch is served to us, and we get a chance to lie around in the sun. They never get a chance to lie around anywhere. After lunch is done and they've cleaned up the pots, they set off and arrive at the evening campsite, and there they set immediately to work at putting up our tents and starting dinner. And they work right through, and usually they're not in bed until, I would say, 9 o'clock.
Robin Witter.
The Sherpas and the porters seem to be carrying weights perhaps up to and over 100 pounds in total, which is the most incredible weight. I've tried lifting them, and it is all I can do is to lift them off the ground. And in fact, it almost makes one feel somewhat ashamed of oneself.
In moments when one's conscience is in overdrive, it's hard not to see this expedition as an obscenity. Our porters are making $2.50 a day. These things all add up to a picture of incredible frivolity. We're here for fun, where our equipment is worth a fortune in their eyes. Our cameras, our tape recorders, our tents, our sleeping bags are all of course bundles of loot that they could sell and retire on almost. And yet we're here for fun. We can give away our T-shirts, we can give away our sleeping bags, but for them it's not life or death, but it's a matter of a year, 2 years, 3 years income. If you dwell on these thoughts a lot, you couldn't have much fun wherever you go in the world. But it is something to think about when you're on a trip like this in a third world country.
Robin Witter, who will be paddling the double canoe with John Goodwin.
Perhaps the most remarkable load of all and the most amazing sight is in fact one porter carrying a C2 on his own. This he manages to achieve by slinging it sideways across his shoulders and walking with it protruding outwards. Inevitably, when he comes to a narrow part of the path, he has to himself then walk sideways so the boat is pointing along. Now, it's all that John and I can do to lift a C2 and carry it perhaps a couple of 100 yards on an ordinary and flat piece of ground. Over this sort of terrain, how one man can carry the C2 slung sideways with only a band over his head is completely beyond me.
The big fear was that when they reached the gorge, it would prove to be unnavigable.
Quite clearly, the river divides here. We've got a tributary coming in from the left, and I think that's from the Lamjung Himal. The main Marsyandi River disappears totally underground with a fall of some maybe 600 or 700 feet. It's boulder-strewn. There's not a drop of water going over the top of the boulders. I do understand from our leader that the river is in fact flat and perfectly normal above this particular bit where it goes underground. So we should be able to canoe, providing there's a decent breakout point and where we can get the canoes out. But what it does mean, in fact, that it is quite impossible for the whole of the length of the Marsyandi River to be done without getting out of one's canoe. There is not the slightest possibility of anybody considering canoeing that stretch. and a portage will have to be made round it.
Yeah. It's pretty good, that, yeah? See what it's like further up. Don't over the canoe in that bit, chaps.
It seems strange that the Marsyandi, a river the size of the Thames, could simply disappear, but disappear it had. And as a result, some of the fainter-hearted members of the team were ready to throw in the towel. To cope with the crisis, expedition leader Chris Hawkesworth convened a full group meeting. The decision that emerged many hours later was threefold. 1. The main group would continue with the original objective, which was to go up as far as Manang, turn round and canoe as much as possible back. 2. A small party to go up to the Tilicho Lake at 17,000 feet to find the actual source of the Marsyandi. 3. Another small party to go downriver and route find the severe grade 6 water that had been seen on the way up. This third party consisted of the 2 Canadians and the 2 Irishmen. They called themselves the Rice Team, which meant Renegade Irish Canadian Expedition. This three-way split avoided the total collapse of the expedition, and at the time Chris Hawkesworth deluded himself into thinking that all was well.
5 in there? It's good grade 5. Yeah.
Rice Team member Mike Clugston, however, was under no illusions about the situation.
Beyond the business of not feeling like an expedition anymore, not feeling like a team, is the disappointment in the individuals who we thought saw things the way we did, Anton and myself. We were under the misconception, totally unreasonable now it turns out, that we were members of an expedition which is going to run the Marsyandi. And now, of course, the clouds have parted. The sun of reality is shining upon us. And we are in ignorance, no longer. We are on a little paddling holiday to the Himalayas.
Sam Crimble.
Leading an expedition is a fairly difficult job. The fact that we're here paddling in whitewater indicates we're fairly strong personalities. And it takes an even stronger one to harness those personalities into a good working team. And, well, that strong personality just didn't exist.
Credit where it's due to Chris. He's a very good organiser. But there were times when he should have made a hard and fast decision. And he would throw it open to everybody. And there were so many different points of view that it was impossible to come to an agreement.
No plain decision was made at that junction, which could have easily been done. And we went all round in a complete circle again, back to the logistics of being able to walk up to Manang in 3 days and back again in 3 days. And if I ran my business like Chris controlled that meeting, I can't understand, being perfectly blunt, how Chris is in business in the way that he is.
The main party who were going up to Manang planned to get there in just under 4 days. This would leave them enough time to do the descent of the Marsyandi on schedule and meet up with the 2 other parties. The after effects of the meeting were still being felt, but not everyone was as bitter as the Canadians.
When the split occurred after the meeting, I was a little bit saddened that the expedition was split into 3 parts. But the good thing was it enabled everyone to be able to do what they particularly wanted to do, and also it enabled the expedition probably to reach more objectives than it would do, sticking together as a large group.
When the main party reached Manang, they discovered that the purists who were going higher to the Tilicho Lake to find the source of the Marsyandi had passed through the day before. The main party were now ready to concentrate on the descent. Nigel Timmins.
The top bit up here certainly isn't flat and going to be very, very technical, going to be much harder than I anticipated. There's sort of mentions of sort of long stretches of grade 1, but it's going to be a very technical grade 3 for most of it. And although I think all of it's going to be canoeable, it's a matter of whether you got to bash your boat up to the point of destruction before you even get down to the meaty part below the gorge.
It will be quite difficult for us in the C2. Certainly all that I've seen we would aim to do but I wouldn't think it's going to be quite as easy as we'd expected. There are a lot of rocks in the river which are going to have to be avoided. The water itself, of course, is absolutely ice cold now, and it's going to be full wetsuits, and we're going to have our work cut out doing this part of the river.
At 13,000 feet, the rarefied atmosphere was giving several of the main party headaches, nausea and feelings of lethargy. This created concern for the advance group, who were going up to the Tilicho Lake at 17,000 feet. They were ill-prepared, poorly equipped, but above all, they were not mountaineers.
Well, after reaching Manang yesterday, we've done quite well. We've got about 5 miles to go to reach the Tilicho Lake tomorrow, which is the source of the Marsyandi. Bob's going extremely well, so is Di. The dear Dutchman Peter isn't too well at all.
This is Peter Stipdong. I haven't slept last night, so I tried to go on to the Tilicho Lake. I had a headache now for 2 days. It's from the altitude, I think.
Bob Smith, Wednesday the 29th. The altitude is affecting us all in different ways. Peter's very bad. Di and Alan have both got headaches, and I'm running short of breath. The view up here is fantastic. I'm very glad that we split from the main party. I think the decision to split 3 ways was a good idea. This way, it means we're having a good crack at all the Marsyandi. One thing, paddling at this height is going to be pretty difficult because 1, the lack of oxygen, and 2, the water is just above freezing. Wearing a wetsuit won't help either because it will restrict the breathing. In my case, that's going to be disastrous.
The main party had walked up the side of the Marsyandi, so they knew that the river was more or less flat, although it was still unpredictable. Once they were on the river, they intended to arrive at the camp about 15 miles downstream by 3 p.m. The day had started well, but it ended with a potential catastrophe.
How long before it goes dark?
Well, that'll be all right.
Chris Hawkesworth arrives with the bad news.
Well, as far as I can make out, most of the party's stuck at the bottom of the gorge and able to get out. We set off after, where we left you filming and stuff, and got down there, and we came to the first boulder choke, and I dropped my boat in the water, so we had to fish that out. And then we went on further until we finally got totally stuck. I lost my paddle, and I had to climb out, and climbed out with Graham Tuff's help, and we very nearly peeled off the top of the cliff down the bottom. We had to come straight up the cliff with loose boulders and everything. Everybody else is all right? Well, as far as I know, but I don't know where they are.
This was the moment the team were dreading, and a search party was immediately organised. It was getting dark, and several paddlers were missing in what was a very dangerous section of the gorge. The serious canoeing had not even started, and the missing canoeists were in a situation where the temperature would soon plunge below 0. The consequences didn't bear thinking about.
Well, where you been, pal?
Having quite a little epic. Flaming River goes underground. And then so we
pulled out there, left our boats because we realised we'd only got an hour of daylight. I was just desperate getting out of that gorge. We'd committed ourselves a bit anyway by going in to the gorge, but...
You're totally committed in the end. You've just got 3 solid walls, 200 feet high. There's only about 100 yards of the river that you can't do, though. Up to there, it's canoeable. But it all goes through a gap about 3 foot wide.
And then goes underground.
Goes underground for about 100 yards.
What's happened to Les?
Les is
behind us. We're all okay.
It's at distance.
Well, we've left those down by the river.
Everybody was relieved to find the missing paddlers as quickly as they did. But as a result of this near disaster, more than one person wondered what was likely to happen if the Rice team bit off more than they could chew on the big waters downstream. The main party was far bigger and had all the resources for a rescue, whereas if the Rice team got into trouble, they would just not have the numbers available to get out of a similar mess. Not for the first time, many of the team wondered if the 3-way split was the right thing to do. Rice team member Anton Geranchuk.
We really enjoyed the time that we had together. It didn't take long to form a very, very close bond. It was like a mutual concern, a mutual support, a mutual appreciation of each other's abilities, of each other's weaknesses, of really being aware of all the other people on the river.
The Rice team of 4 paddlers encountered one grade 5 rapid, which took us by surprise. The idea was to skirt the boulder on the left and then quickly turn right in order to miss some waves. Well, it didn't happen that way. I luckily just went right through it. I didn't have any idea what the danger was. And I turned around and I saw Jerry pinned on a rock. I saw Anton doing a little back loop because the wave caught him and threw him back into the hole. And Sam was nowhere in sight, and Sam should have been in sight. By this time, although Anton and I and Jerry didn't know it, Sam was also in the water swimming.
Suddenly, the pace quickens, and you're right in the middle of it and plop into a big hole. When you drop into a hole, there is a couple of seconds where you are on the surface. You're bracing before maybe you're flipped over. So, time to get out. And swimming down rapids, not very nice. I was really gripped up about that rapid today. When I got to the bottom, my hands were shaking.
The main group was progressing well on the sections that could be canoed. The problems on the river ranged from 40-foot waterfalls to boulder chokes, and on the water the canoeing was hard and dangerous. The raging river was living up to its reputation. The Tilicho Lake Party were lighter and more mobile, and therefore were able to climb faster. They were also able to descend faster because they could do more walking, whereas the main group were canoeing and travelling at a slower pace. The main group had estimated that the Tilicho Lake Party would catch up with them at Charmey, and right on time the others arrived, with Peter van Stipdonk in the lead. The 2 groups caught up with the Rice team the following night.
After the main group rejoined the Rice team at the top of the navigable part of the river, it quickly became evident that the Rice team, rather than being outcasts, had gained enormously in stature in the eyes of the rest of the team. I think there are 2 reasons behind this. One is that in an expedition such as ours, where there is no strong leading hand, where there's no clear-cut leader, In this situation, any sort of a clear, strong hand will be admired and, if not followed, at least will be looked up to. And the Rice team, in breaking away from the main group, made a very strong show of what they wanted to do. We took ourselves off in a direction that we thought would be good for us and good for the expedition as a whole. At the time we did that, there was some doubt about our judgment. Now there seems to be no question that we did the right thing. So that's the first reason. The second is because of our additional 6 days of paddling, our skills are much sharper than the others. And since we've run this section of river 3 times now, we're the natural leaders, and everybody is following behind us as we run these difficult sections. And so through this process of rebellion and strong-headedness, through our own initiative, we've turned out to become the leaders of the expedition, on the river at any rate, if not on the land.
The river became big enough by the time we reached Coody for the rafts to put back on. The guys who were rowing the rafts did a tremendous job because the river was still quite technical, probably more technical than they'd ever rafted before. And to manage to take boats of that size down these rapids was a tremendous job on their part.
The rapids are now becoming almost continuous, which makes it a big problem, especially for us in the C2. If we do capsize, is that we're asking other members of the expedition to rescue us. And one can't help but remember on this occasion about Mike Jones, who lost his life doing just that.
It's so easy for a C2 to capsize. In a kayak, it's one mind and one boat working together, whereas in a C2 you have 2 minds which have got to be synchronized, and if one should slightly go out of synchronization, the chances are the boat is going to capsize.
Sometimes the water can flip you over before you know it. Suddenly you're upside down. This really is one of the great dangers. You can be taken into a hole from whence you have to swim, and then you have the difficulty of being a swimmer in water that's going at, say, 20 miles an hour, which is ice cold, which is filled with fairly sharp, fairly shallow rocks.
The river is moving extremely fast. I should estimate the speed at between 20 and 25 miles an hour. Put your boat speed on top of that and you've got speeds approaching 30 miles an hour. This is going to take split-second reaction to change it in direction.
We took the second down, Alan Barber leading in the kayak. We took the first large wave, which turned out to be a great deal larger than we'd expected, and certainly burst over the top of my head. I took that line very nicely and threw the first stopper and then carried on down. Unfortunately, I had not inspected the second of the 2 stoppers, and a moment's lack of concentration and we capsized immediately and failed to roll.
And in a C2, it's much more difficult to right the canoe because, again, you've got to have 2 people working perfectly together. And in this type of water, this heavy water, it's very difficult to do that. The thing that made people a little bit wary was if they should capsize and come in difficulty, you're going to have to put your own life possibly at risk to go and rescue them. But in actual fact, whenever they did capsize, no one ever hesitated to go in and rescue them. On the latter days of paddling, I think a tremendous feeling of satisfaction was building up through people, having achieved what we'd set out to do, especially without the loss of any lives. I personally was very glad to have got out of it in one piece, having had a couple of tricky moments, again, which was a relief. Really, compared to anything I've ever paddled before, the water was tremendous, very, very fast and continuous. Just continuous rapids for mile after mile. We're often eating lunch by about 10:30 in the morning due to the very early starts that we're making. During lunch we had time to reflect on the paddling that we'd done during the morning sessions, go over some of the problems and some of the exciting bits and pieces that we got caught up in, and everyone had their own story of their particular desperate situation, and lunchtime became quite entertaining from that point of view.
Canoeing in the Himalayas is a recent thing, and I would have thought a purpose of an expedition like this is to evolve an ethic. Does the river start at the watershed? Does it start at a lake? Does it start at the upper limit of navigation? When is canoeing a rapid justifiable, and when is it not justifiable? Hopefully at the end of the trip we'll have thrashed out this, so any other trip coming out could say, well, the Marsyandi trip did this and the Marsyandi trip did that, and we'll have given something back to the sport of canoeing.
We had a very good logistics exercise. We were large enough to cope with a three-way split without either of the groups being anything other than self-contained. Each could do their own thing within the overall idea that we would canoe the river from its source to the confluence with the Trisuli. And by doing so, I think we added considerably to the annals of canoeing history by expanding the forefront of canoeing within the Annapurna area. Because one must remember that the Everest area with the Mike Jones expedition and other American expeditions was extremely well explored. And of course there is the big magnet of Everest. And the Annapurna region has largely been unexplored from a water-borne basis. And so it was extremely successful from that point of view. The telling of any expedition, of course, is whether or not people will still remember it fondly 10 years on.